Edward's quiet entrance into the showroom that day was marked by his unmistakable air of quiet confidence, even if the others failed to notice it. He took in the scene slowly, observing the gleaming luxury cars lined up like precious jewels, each one a testament to engineering precision, power, and elegance. He felt a deep appreciation for the craftsmanship before him, for the time and skill it took to create something so intricate and beautiful. And as he took it all in, he felt a spark of youthful excitement, a rarity for him these days. Despite his apparent lack of urgency, Edward had a specific car in mind. He'd spent months researching the model, watching reviews and contemplating if this purchase was something he truly wanted. His logical, disciplined mind had analyzed every aspect, calculating the cost-to-benefit ratios, considering depreciation, and assessing maintenance. Yet even after all the practical assessments, there was a whisper of desire that remained. This wasn't just about transportation, it was a symbol of his journey, his perseverance, and his eventual triumph. And so, on that overcast afternoon, he'd put on his finest suit, picked up his old cane, and decided to act on that desire. As Edward lingered, his gaze caught a slick black coupe positioned in the center of the room. Its sleek lines and sophisticated curves made it stand out like a piece of modern art, a contrast to the chrome-heavy SUVs and sports cars around it. To Edward, this car represented more than just luxury. It was a blend of beauty and performance, a product of intelligent design, and he was drawn to it. He took a careful step toward the vehicle, resting a hand on the smooth, polished hood, feeling a sense of anticipation rising within him. Meanwhile, the staff was buzzing around, engaged in animated conversations with well-dressed clients, all while strategically ignoring Edward. They chuckled and exchanged pleasantries, offering complimentary espressos and sparkling water to the new arrivals. Edward watched as another customer, a young man in a tailored suit with slicked back hair, swaggered in, his presence immediately acknowledged by the sales team. They flocked to him like moths to a flame, offering him exaggerated nods of approval and endless options to test drive. The contrast was sharp, and Edward found himself almost amused by it, a quiet chuckle forming at the corner of his lips. He knew he could walk up to any of the salesmen, declare his intent to buy, and likely command their attention in an instant. But there was something satisfying about simply observing, about being an unnoticed witness in a world that was obsessed with surface impressions. He remembered a lesson his father had once shared with him as a boy, something about the difference between true wealth and the appearance of it. True wealth, his father had said, was quiet, like a river flowing deep beneath the earth. Those who had to flaunt it on the surface often did so to compensate for a lack of depth. It was a belief that had guided Edward through much of his life. Despite his reserved nature, there was something undeniably captivating about Edward Langston. A stillness and poise emanated from him, a quiet aura of purpose that only a few could recognize. It was as though he had unlocked a secret that eluded most, a deep satisfaction that came from knowing he had achieved his goals without needing anyone else's approval. And though he hadn't sought attention, a younger salesman with sandy hair, barely out of his 20s, finally noticed him and walked over. "Hello, sir," the salesman greeted, his tone polite but uncertain, as though he were addressing a mystery he couldn't quite solve. "Can I help you with something?" Edward turned slowly, his eyes kind but discerning. He offered a small nod. "Yes, young man, I was hoping to take a closer look at this car." He gestured toward the black coupe, his voice steady and calm. The salesman blinked, seeming momentarily surprised, but he quickly recovered and tried to hide his initial hesitation. "Certainly, sir. This is one of our premium models, a favorite among certain types of clients." There was an unspoken assumption in his words, a subtle implication that this car might be better suited to the more affluent, perhaps younger, clientele. Edward didn't miss it, but he merely offered a slight smile. "A fine choice," he said, letting his fingers trace the smooth, polished surface. "It's a beautiful machine." As the salesman launched into a rehearsed speech about the car's technical specifications, its horsepower, torque, and various luxury features, Edward listened with polite interest, though he already knew most of what was being shared. It was clear that the young man hadn't expected Edward to understand the specifics, much less show any genuine interest, and he hesitated at times, as though unsure whether he was wasting his time. But Edward's calm, attentive manner seemed to reassure him, and soon he became more animated, genuinely enthusiastic about the car he was describing. Edward asked a few well-informed questions, delving into the finer points of the vehicle's engineering. The salesman looked surprised but pleased, perhaps finding a certain unexpected respect growing for this quiet, unassuming man. They spoke at length, their conversation drifting from the car's features to more abstract topics like the philosophy of design, the balance of luxury and functionality, and the pursuit of perfection. By the end of it, the young salesman was no longer just talking to a customer. He was engaged in a genuine conversation, and he found himself respecting Edward in a way he hadn't anticipated. Finally, Edward glanced around the showroom, his gaze resting momentarily on the busy sales staff still swarming around the other clients. He looked back at the salesman. "Thank you for your time, young man," he said, his voice carrying a note of warmth. "I believe this is the car for me." The salesman's eyes widened in surprise. Are you saying you'd like to purchase it?" Edward offered a nod. "Yes, indeed. I've had my eye on this model for quite some time. I trust you'll assist me with the paperwork." The young man scrambled to recover his composure, barely managing to stammer out a response. "Of course, sir. I'd be honored to help you with that." As they began the process, Edward noticed the glances of other staff members. The attention shifted slowly as his intention to purchase became clear, a subtle shift in their demeanor now that they realized the elderly man with the cane was a serious buyer. He saw their curiosity, their quiet embarrassment at having ignored him. Yet he held no resentment. He understood the world they operated in, a world that valued appearances and dismissed subtleties. Edward completed the transaction smoothly, signing his name with the same steady hand that had guided him through countless business ventures over the years. When the paperwork was done, he looked at the young salesman who had handled everything with an impressive professionalism, despite his initial assumptions. Edward extended his hand. "Thank you," Edward said, his voice warm and sincere. "You've been a fine help." The salesman took his hand, clearly moved. "Thank you, sir. It's been an honor." Edward left the dealership that day in his new car, a quiet satisfaction settling over him as he drove off. He'd purchased a symbol of his journey, a reminder that true wealth was not in the car he now drove, but in the years of hard work and dedication it represented. The staff at the dealership would remember him, not just for his surprising purchase, but for the lesson he had left behind. A reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that true worth was often hidden beneath the surface. In the weeks that followed, Edward's story spread quietly through the dealership, transforming into a subtle legend among the staff. New hires would hear it from their colleagues, a tale of the elderly gentleman who'd walked in, seemingly unassuming, only to leave in one of the most expensive cars on the lot. And for Edward, that quiet legacy was more valuable than any luxury car. It was a testament to the life he had lived, a life defined not by display but by depth. Edward took a deep breath as he stepped outside, feeling the crisp air cool against his skin, grounding him. His gaze drifted back through the dealership's wide glass windows, where the same scene continued to unfold in his absence. The young, flashy customer, a picture of all the dealership staff's attention and adoration, was now seated in one of the luxury sports cars, laughing as a salesman eagerly pointed out features. It was as if Edward had never been there, as if he was as insignificant as a leaf blown in by the wind. His composure remained intact, but inside he felt an unusual tension brewing. It wasn't anger exactly, but a mix of emotions he hadn't felt in years, perhaps decades. He could brush off the haughty attitude of a single salesperson or the dismissive glance from another. But this was different. They'd all judged him, categorically dismissed him, and treated him as though he were invisible. They had not even seen him as a person, but merely as a distraction in their pursuit of high-profile sales and commissions. Edward's thoughts drifted to the young salesman with the dismissive tone. "The models start at $100,000, sir." He could still hear the words, their dismissiveness grating in his memory. But it was the attitude behind them, the implication that Edward didn't belong, that stirred something deep within him. Wealth, he'd always believed, was a tool, a silent partner in his life, not something he wielded like a weapon or a badge. It was for security, for opportunities, for building and creating, not for belittling others. As Edward made his way to his car, his old modest sedan parked amidst a sea of gleaming new vehicles, the irritation lingered. He'd never wanted to flaunt his wealth, never felt the need to prove himself. Yet as he sat in his worn driver's seat, he found himself unwilling to let this experience fade into a distant memory. He felt a growing desire to challenge the superficial judgments he'd witnessed, to confront their assumptions about what it meant to be a man of substance. The idea forming in his mind was simple, but as he dwelled on it, a subtle smile began to play at the corners of his mouth. He'd spent a lifetime building his fortune quietly, investing wisely, and growing his wealth not just for himself, but for the future of his family and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. He'd amassed wealth beyond the comprehension of most people in that dealership, and yet he had been dismissed, disregarded, and left to drift out of their world of luxury. They had assumed they could decide who was worthy based on a quick glance, a set of clothes, or the appearance of a worn pair of shoes. And now he intended to teach them just how mistaken they were. Edward spent that evening sitting alone in his study, a quiet sanctuary in his home. Shelves lined with books on finance, history, and philosophy surrounded him, each one a testament to the life he had led. A life of learning, of calculated risks, and of decisions made with quiet integrity. He sat in his favorite leather armchair, sipping tea as he let his thoughts flow, mapping out a plan in his mind. He wanted to approach this carefully, not out of pettiness or revenge, but as a lesson. Perhaps, he thought, there was a way to show them the cost of their short-sightedness. Over the following days, Edward spent hours on research, making calls, speaking with various high-profile individuals in his network, people who could open doors to opportunities most of the dealership employees couldn't fathom. The longer he spent strategizing, the clearer his vision became. He decided to establish a foundation, a charitable organization that would focus on giving opportunities to those who, like him, had often been overlooked or underestimated. It was a way to create something larger than himself, something lasting, and he knew exactly where he wanted to start. Within a week, Edward's vision had taken shape. He secured partnerships with high-end brands, renowned financiers, and even luxury automotive manufacturers, people he had come to know over his decades in business. It was astonishing, really, how quickly the wealthy and powerful were willing to listen to an old man like him when they recognized his reputation and influence. And so his plan expanded. What began as a desire to challenge a single dealership's prejudice grew into something far more substantial. On the day he planned to return to the dealership, Edward prepared meticulously. He dressed in a tailored suit, simple yet elegant, one that hinted at quality without ostentation. His well-worn cane was polished, a nod to his usual modesty, though today he carried with him an air of quiet authority. He wasn't here to flaunt his wealth, but he wanted his presence felt. As he approached the dealership doors, the same young salesman from before noticed him and froze. There was a flicker of recognition, perhaps even a momentary pang of guilt in his eyes, but the hesitation didn't last. The salesman quickly looked away, as though hoping Edward might simply pass by without incident. But this time, Edward did not allow himself to be overlooked. With a calm and steady pace, he walked directly up to the young man and extended his hand. "Good afternoon," Edward said, his voice warm yet firm. "I believe we met last time I was here. I didn't get the chance to properly introduce myself." The salesman, momentarily taken aback, managed a hesitant smile. Yes. Good afternoon, sir. I remember." Edward's gaze was steady. "That's good," he replied, a slight glimmer of amusement in his eye. "Today, I'd like to discuss a business proposition with your manager." The salesman blinked, clearly caught off guard. He nodded, fumbling for words, and finally managed, "Yes, of course. I'll get him right away." Edward watched as the young man scurried off to find the manager, who soon appeared, his demeanor instantly professional yet guarded. The manager had a practiced, accommodating smile, though it lacked any genuine warmth or understanding. Edward could tell he was regarded as an inconvenience, just another task to be handled. With a respectful nod, Edward introduced himself. Thank you for taking the time, Mr. Chambers. I'll get straight to the point. I'm here to discuss a potential partnership with your dealership. Mr. Chambers raised an eyebrow, intrigued yet wary. A partnership? I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I understand. Edward gestured subtly to the dealership around them. I represent a foundation that I believe could be of mutual benefit to both of us. My foundation is dedicated to offering opportunities and resources to individuals who are often overlooked or underestimated. We partner with luxury brands to provide experiences and mentorship to those who may not typically have access to them. I'd like to make your dealership one of our initial partners. The manager's smile flickered, shifting into something more genuine as he processed Edward's words. He clearly hadn't expected this elderly gentleman to be speaking about foundations and partnerships, let alone one connected to luxury experiences. What, what exactly are you proposing, Mr. Langston? The manager asked, his tone softening. I propose that we organize an event here, Edward explained. An exclusive opportunity where clients from my foundation can visit the dealership, interact with your staff, learn about these vehicles, and perhaps even have the chance to test drive a few. It would be a way to broaden the perception of luxury and offer a unique experience to those who might not otherwise walk through your doors. The manager considered this, visibly intrigued, but perhaps still a touch skeptical. I see. And Mr. Langston, may I ask what inspired you to approach us with this idea? Edward met the manager's gaze, a small, knowing smile on his lips. Let's just say that I believe there's value in looking beyond appearances, he replied calmly. Your team might find there's more to people than meets the eye. The subtle weight of his words hung in the air, and Edward could tell the manager understood the message, even if he remained silent on the matter. In the days that followed, Edward's event began to take shape. Invitations were sent out, special arrangements were made, and a buzz of anticipation grew. Staff at the dealership prepared for an entirely new kind of clientele, guests who represented a diversity of backgrounds and experiences. When the day of the event finally arrived, the dealership was transformed into a place of open welcome, of genuine interest and engagement. For the first time, Edward saw the staff interacting without judgment, offering their time and attention to each person, regardless of their attire or perceived status. The young salesman, the same one who had dismissed Edward, was attentive and gracious, treating each guest as a valued individual. The change was palpable, and Edward watched with quiet satisfaction. As he observed the dealership now, Edward felt that this was not merely a personal victory, it was a shift in perspective for everyone involved. The lesson he'd set out to teach had become something far more profound, a reminder that the worth of a person could never be measured by appearances alone. And as the event came to a close, Edward slipped away quietly, content in knowing that he had left behind something far more valuable than any car, a lasting change in the way people saw one another. As Edward sat in his armchair, the weight of the decision he had made settled upon him like a cloak, familiar and comforting. He'd made hundreds of choices throughout his life that had shaped his path, each one grounded in a commitment to his principles. Tonight, however, the decision to buy the dealership wasn't about self-satisfaction or retribution. It was about setting an example, demonstrating how dignity and respect ought to be inherent in any place of business, particularly one that represented luxury and class. In the quiet of his study, he reached for his phone, dialing the numbers of old friends and business associates he knew would be interested in joining him on this venture. One by one they answered, each conversation a mix of business and camaraderie. Edward was careful with his words, laying out the vision he had for transforming the dealership, bringing together people who valued humility and human dignity just as much as financial success. The contacts he reached out to were not just investors, they were visionaries, people who had watched him rise through the ranks with admiration, who respected his insight and integrity. By the time he finished his calls, Edward had a small but dedicated group of partners on board. Each of them had seen their own fair share of hardships and had reached success without the need for bravado. They all understood what Edward wanted to achieve, and they agreed to stand beside him as silent investors, knowing that he wanted to remain the face of this transformation. In the days that followed, Edward's resolve only grew. He met with legal advisors, pored over financial documents, and made discreet inquiries about the dealership's financial health. As he gathered more information, he found himself both amused and disappointed. The dealership, despite its flashy exterior, was not performing as well as the staff's self-assuredness suggested. They were struggling to meet targets, hindered by their narrow approach to clientele and a misguided sense of exclusivity. In their pursuit of the ultra-wealthy, they had neglected a more inclusive strategy, alienating potential customers who could have contributed to a steady revenue stream. This realization only deepened Edward's resolve. He understood now that he could do more than buy a dealership. He could completely reshape its operations, creating a new business model that welcomed all clients with genuine respect. Edward's plan grew in scope. He would introduce a culture that emphasized customer relationships over elitism, where each person who walked through the doors was seen as an individual with unique desires and means, not as a transaction to be measured against arbitrary thresholds. Finally, everything was in place. Edward's offer, backed by his silent investors, was strong enough to be accepted without delay. Within weeks, he found himself sitting across from the dealership's current owner, a seasoned businessman who had operated the dealership with a hands-off approach, trusting his managers to run day-to-day operations. The man listened as Edward outlined his vision for the dealership, nodding in approval but clearly bemused. "Why this dealership?" the owner finally asked. Curiosity etched into his expression. "With your wealth, Mr. Langston, I'm sure you could pursue just about any venture. Why here?" Edward's eyes met the owner's, calm and resolute. "Because, Mr. Calloway, I believe this dealership represents an opportunity to change something larger than cars or profit margins. I want to create a place that values people, regardless of how much they're willing to spend. I think you'll agree that in a business like this, reputation is everything, and that reputation should reflect a level of respect and decency." The owner regarded him thoughtfully, taking a long pause before nodding. "If that's your vision, Mr. Langston, I'm glad it's in your hands. This dealership could use some new direction." With the deal finalized, Edward became the new owner of the dealership, but to the staff, it was just another day, with none of them aware that the silent, elderly man they'd brushed off weeks ago was now their employer. Edward decided to keep a low profile at first, allowing himself to slip in and observe the daily routines. He dressed in his usual modest attire and spent hours quietly watching from the background, studying each employee's behavior, their treatment of clients, and their attitudes toward each other. He noticed that the young salesman who had been so dismissive of him before seemed to thrive on a mixture of charm and arrogance, quickly directing his attention to clients he deemed worthy and brushing off others with practiced indifference. There were others like him, people who had adopted the same sense of entitlement, the belief that they were gatekeepers to an exclusive club, a club that anyone who didn't meet their standards was unworthy of entering. But Edward also observed a few employees who stood apart, those who welcomed every client with genuine enthusiasm and kindness, regardless of outward appearances. It was clear to him that the dealership had potential, but it was weighed down by an unbalanced culture that needed a serious shift. In the coming weeks, Edward took steps to implement gradual changes. First, he introduced training sessions focused on customer service, emphasizing empathy, patience, and the importance of truly listening to clients' needs. He crafted these sessions with care, incorporating principles he'd learned over his lifetime. Principles of humility, integrity, and respect for others. He called in experts he trusted, professionals with decades of experience in customer relations, to lead these sessions and share their insights. Edward's vision was clear. He wanted to instill a sense of pride in serving others, to create a culture where each client was valued for who they were, not for the size of their bank account. Edward also made changes to the dealership's marketing strategy. The advertisements shifted away from their narrow focus on ultra-luxury buyers and instead highlighted the dealership's dedication to quality and service. He implemented a program offering free workshops for anyone interested in learning about car maintenance, basic repairs, and understanding automotive technology. These sessions, he hoped, would bring in clients who had previously felt unwelcome and provide value to the community beyond mere transactions. The staff's reaction to these changes was mixed. Some embraced the new approach, eager to be part of something more inclusive, while others struggled with a shift in perspective, reluctant to let go of the prestige-driven mindset they'd grown accustomed to. Edward observed it all with patience, knowing that transformation took time. He saw how some of the resistant staff members looked down upon the clients attending the free workshops, their glances betraying subtle disdain. But Edward's resolve remained unshaken. In an unexpected move, Edward also began a mentorship program, pairing senior staff with newer, younger employees, encouraging an exchange of knowledge and experiences. To foster a culture of mutual respect, he personally participated in the program, sharing his own journey and the lessons he learned with employees who were eager to listen. During one such session, Edward shared a story from his youth about a time he had been dismissed because of his modest beginnings. The staff listened intently, perhaps some of them recognizing their own behavior reflected in his words. Over the following months, Edward's approach started bearing fruit. Clients of all backgrounds began visiting the dealership, drawn not only by the quality of the cars, but by the welcoming atmosphere Edward had fostered. The staff found themselves building real connections with clients, understanding their needs on a deeper level, and experiencing a newfound sense of pride in their work. The dealership's revenue began to increase, driven not by flashy promotions, but by customer loyalty and word of mouth. The young salesman who had once dismissed Edward, however, struggled to adapt. His charm, which had once seemed like an asset, was now an obvious facade in a dealership built on authenticity. He found himself at odds with the new culture, and Edward watched as the young man wrestled with his own ambitions, torn between adapting to the new values or clinging to his old ways. One afternoon, Edward called the young salesman into his office, a spacious room lined with bookshelves and a single window overlooking the city skyline. The young man entered nervously, visibly aware of the changes that had swept through the dealership and how ill-suited he felt within this new culture. "Take a seat," Edward said gently, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. The young man sat down, looking uncertain, his bravado nowhere to be found. Edward observed him for a moment before speaking. "When I walked into this dealership a few months ago, you judged me," Edward began, his tone even. "You assumed that because of the way I looked, I didn't belong here. Do you remember that?" The young man's cheeks reddened and he nodded, avoiding Edward's gaze. "Yes, sir, I remember." Edward leaned forward, his expression kind but firm. "We've all made mistakes, myself included. The important thing is that we learn from them. This dealership isn't just a place to sell cars. It's a place where people come with dreams, goals, and sometimes just the hope of being treated with respect. I hope that as you move forward, you'll remember that." The young man nodded again, visibly humbled. "I understand, sir. I want to change." Edward offered him a small smile. "Then let's start today." As Edward watched the young man leave his office, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The dealership had transformed not just in its outward appearance, but in its soul. The culture shift was real, and it had taken root. What began as a reaction to a moment of humiliation had grown into something profound, an entire organization rebuilt around dignity, respect, and the understanding that true worth could never be measured by appearances alone. And so, Edward continued his work, not only running the dealership but nurturing it, ensuring that it remained a place where every person, client, or employee was valued. In the end, Edward's greatest victory wasn't in buying the dealership, but in transforming it, leaving a legacy of integrity that would last long after he was gone. Edward's footsteps echoed through the polished marble floors of the dealership as he moved with unhurried grace, the embodiment of quiet authority. He scanned the faces around him, noting the shock and discomfort that flickered in the eyes of the staff. To them, he was no longer just a dismissed customer in worn shoes. He was the man who now held their futures in his hands, the man who had caught them all in the very act of their own arrogance. The senior manager, Mr. Wainwright, was among the first to approach him, his steps faltering slightly as he struggled to reconcile the unassuming figure before him with the powerful new owner he had heard about. The manager extended a tentative hand, his forced smile a poor mask for his unease. "Mr. Langston," he began, the uncertainty in his voice betraying his nerves. "We had no idea. I didn't realize. That is to say." Edward looked at him, a gentle, almost sympathetic smile on his face, allowing the man to flounder for a moment before extending his own hand in return. "Good morning, Mr. Wainwright," he said, his tone calm and warm, yet unmistakably firm. "I understand you didn't recognize me, and perhaps that's for the best. Today, however, I'm here to make a few introductions and discuss some changes." Mr. Wainwright nodded, glancing back at the other salespeople who had gathered, each of them wearing expressions of guilt and confusion. It was clear they had all quickly pieced together what had happened. They now understood that the elderly gentleman they dismissed had seen more than they realized and held more influence than they could have imagined. Edward sensed the unease thickening in the room, but he remained calm, giving them the opportunity to process their own discomfort. "Please, everyone," Edward continued, his voice carrying a note of invitation, "join me in the conference room. I'd like to speak with all of you." As he led them into the sleek, glass-walled conference room, Edward could feel the weight of anticipation in the air. The staff trickled in, filling the seats around the long, polished table, many of them casting furtive glances in his direction, as if still hoping they could somehow make a favorable impression. They were subdued, unusually quiet, and Edward could sense their minds racing, some perhaps searching for excuses or rehearsing apologies. Edward took a seat at the head of the table, leaning forward slightly, his fingers resting on his cane, his gaze steady and composed. "Thank you all for joining me this morning," he began, allowing his eyes to meet each of theirs in turn. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. My name is Edward Langston, and as you may have heard, I'm now the new owner of this dealership." The room remained silent, and he could almost feel their collective breath hitch. Edward let the silence stretch for a moment, giving the weight of his words time to settle. He knew they were all acutely aware of the irony, of their complete dismissal of him just days prior, and the sting of their own judgment now turned back upon them. "I've spent many years in business," Edward continued, his tone steady and warm, but edged with the clarity of purpose. "And in that time, I've learned that the true measure of any establishment lies not in the products it sells or the wealth of its clients, but in the respect and dignity with which it treats every person who walks through its doors." A few of the employees shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, as Edward's words struck a chord of recognition. He saw the young salesman who had been so curt with him that day, now sitting with his head slightly bowed, his hands folded in his lap. Edward addressed the group as a whole, but he allowed his gaze to rest on the young man, making sure he could feel the weight of his attention. "When I first visited this dealership, I had hoped to receive the same respect that each of you expects for yourselves," Edward said, his tone firm yet devoid of anger. "Instead, I was dismissed based on assumptions, treated as though I was unworthy of your time and attention. And I'm not the only one. Many others, I suspect, have had similar experiences." A ripple of quiet shame passed through the room. Some of the staff looked down at the table, while others maintained their gaze on Edward, their faces reflecting a dawning realization. Edward waited for a moment, allowing the silence to hang between them, ensuring that his message resonated. "Now I'm here to change that," he continued, his voice taking on a calm yet commanding edge. "As of today, this dealership will operate on a new set of principles that are rooted in respect, integrity, and service. Every person who walks through these doors, whether they arrive in a limousine or on foot, will be treated with the same level of respect." He could feel the resistance in the room, not overt but simmering under the surface. He knew this transition would not be easy, especially for those who had grown comfortable with a culture of elitism and judgment. But Edward also knew that he had the authority to reshape this environment, to establish a new standard that would endure beyond his tenure. "To help us on this path," he continued, "I've invited a team of experts to work with each of you. They'll provide training on customer service, focusing on empathy, communication, and respect. I expect every one of you to participate fully and approach this with an open mind." The senior manager, Mr. Wainwright, nodded, his expression now one of cautious approval, as though he understood that Edward's intentions extended beyond mere discipline. Some of the other staff members exchanged uncertain glances, but Edward held their attention, ensuring they recognized the weight of his expectations. The young salesman, the one who had dismissed Edward with a cavalier attitude, finally spoke, his voice hesitant yet tinged with a hint of remorse. "Mr. Langston, I apologize for the way I treated you that day. I... I didn't realize." Edward met his gaze, his expression thoughtful but kind. "I appreciate your apology, and I hope you'll take this opportunity to grow, to learn that every interaction, no matter how brief, is a chance to demonstrate respect. It's a lesson I believe will serve you well, not just here, but in all aspects of your life." The young man nodded, visibly humbled, and Edward felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that this experience would leave a lasting impact on him. But Edward wasn't finished. He wanted to make it clear that this transformation was not optional, that the dealership's future depended on each person's commitment to these values. "In addition to the training," Edward continued, "I've decided to make a few other adjustments. We'll be offering mentorship opportunities within the dealership, pairing experienced staff members with those who are newer or looking to improve. I expect you all to take advantage of these opportunities, to learn from each other and to support each other." As he spoke, Edward's vision for the dealership seemed to take shape, a place where respect and humility reigned, where customers were valued as people rather than as sales targets. He knew it was ambitious, that changing attitudes would take time, but he also knew the power of leading by example. He had seen firsthand how values could inspire transformation when applied with consistency and conviction. Finally, he looked around the room, his gaze softening slightly, sensing the lingering discomfort and uncertainty. "I understand that this is a change, and change can be challenging, but I believe that together we can create an environment where both our clients and staff feel valued and respected. If any of you have doubts, I encourage you to speak with me directly. My door will always be open." With that, Edward rose from his seat, signaling the end of the meeting. The staff members stood, some casting thoughtful glances at each other, while others looked contemplative. Edward gave them a reassuring nod before walking out of the room, leaving them to absorb his words. Over the next several days, Edward remained a steady presence in the dealership, observing, guiding, and engaging with both staff and customers. He spent time with each employee individually, listening to their experiences, their challenges, and their goals. For some, it was a chance to be heard for the first time, and Edward found that many of them were eager to embrace the new vision, realizing the potential for growth and fulfillment in a culture of respect. He noticed changes almost immediately. The atmosphere in the dealership began to shift, small but undeniable. The salespeople who had once brushed off less affluent clients now engaged them with genuine interest, taking time to understand their needs. The reception area, once bustling with superficial greetings reserved only for high-profile clients, now felt warm and inviting to all. Edward saw his vision becoming reality, each interaction a testament to the power of his quiet revolution. Even the young salesman who had once embodied the very arrogance Edward sought to dismantle began to change. He approached each client with renewed humility, his tone softened, his posture more open. Edward observed him with a sense of pride, pleased to see the transformation that was taking root. Weeks passed, and the dealership's reputation began to spread, attracting a new wave of clients drawn not just by the allure of luxury cars, but by the genuine, welcoming environment that had become the dealership's hallmark. Word of mouth brought in clients from all walks of life, each one experiencing the new standards Edward had set in place. For many, it was a refreshing change, a luxury dealership that treated every client with respect, where exclusivity was replaced by inclusivity. One afternoon, as Edward walked through the dealership, a client approached him, a man dressed in modest attire who introduced himself as an old friend of one of Edward's silent investors. The man extended his hand, his eyes alight with admiration. "Mr. Langston, I've heard about what you're doing here. It's truly inspiring," he said warmly. "This place is unlike any dealership I've ever visited. It feels welcoming, like a community." Edward smiled, his gaze thoughtful. "Thank you. That's exactly what I hope to create." As the man departed, Edward watched him go, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey had come full circle, from a day of quiet humiliation to this moment of quiet triumph. He had reclaimed his dignity, not through displays of wealth or power, but by staying true to his values, by lifting others up and creating a legacy rooted in respect. Edward knew that his work at the dealership was far from over, that it would take continued effort and vigilance to maintain the standards he had set. But he was ready, fueled by the knowledge that every day he spent there was a chance to inspire change, to shape a world where people saw each other as equals. As he stood in the heart of the dealership, surrounded by the hum of quiet conversations and warm exchanges, Edward felt the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. He was no longer just a wealthy man buying a luxury car. He was a leader, a mentor, a visionary who had built something far more meaningful. A place where respect reigned, and every person, regardless of appearance, was seen for who they truly were. The room was still as Edward continued speaking, his voice filling every corner, leaving no space for excuses or denial. His gaze was calm yet piercing, conveying both disappointment and resolve. His tone remained steady as he recounted his visit, the way he had been ignored, the dismissive glances, the superiority that some of the staff had wielded as though they were gatekeepers to a sacred institution. He reminded them that wealth and success had never given anyone the right to look down upon others, that true value lay in character and kindness. A few of the staff members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. Edward let them stew in the silence that followed his words. This was not a punishment as much as it was a reckoning, a call to account for behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. Finally, after a pause that felt heavy with unspoken words, he took a breath and began to address the future of the dealership. He turned his gaze to the salespeople who had been guilty of the worst offenses, those who had dismissed him so casually. One by one, he met their eyes, unflinching as he issued each termination with calm professionalism. His words were compassionate but firm, each dismissal delivered as a direct consequence of behavior that had no place in the vision he had for the dealership. There was no anger in his voice, only the quiet authority of a man who was determined to create something better. "I believe in second chances," he told them, his voice still soft yet resolute. "But I also believe that actions carry consequences. The world we're creating here is one where respect is fundamental, where humility is practiced daily, and where no one is dismissed based on outward appearances. If any of you do not see yourselves fitting into that vision, I respect your choice to leave." Some of the staff looked stunned, perhaps thinking he would simply reprimand them and move on. A few stammered out apologies, their voices faltering under the weight of their own guilt. But Edward only gave a nod, a silent acknowledgement, and continued without hesitation. He had made it clear, his tolerance for disrespect was zero, and under his leadership, the dealership would reflect the values he held dear. Then with equal deliberation, he turned his attention to those who had shown kindness and professionalism. There was Mr. Thomas, an older salesperson who had spent his career treating each customer with patience and respect. Then there was Marie, a receptionist who, despite her junior position, had always greeted every visitor warmly, regardless of who they appeared to be. These were the people who embodied the spirit Edward wanted to foster. To them, he offered more than just gratitude. He announced promotions, raises, and new opportunities that would recognize their commitment to the values he sought to instill. "Mr. Thomas," Edward said, his voice carrying a note of respect, "I've watched you treat every client with care, no matter who they are. It's the kind of leadership I want to see more of here. I'd like to offer you the role of senior sales manager, with the expectation that you will help others follow your example." Mr. Thomas's eyes widened, a mix of pride and surprise flickering across his face. He hadn't expected this recognition, especially after years of quietly doing his job without expecting accolades. He stood and offered his hand to Edward, his voice thick with gratitude as he accepted the role, promising to live up to the trust that had been placed in him. "And Marie," Edward continued, turning to the young receptionist, "you've treated every person who walked through our doors with warmth and professionalism. I want you to take on the role of client relations coordinator, someone who ensures that every guest feels valued from the moment they arrive. I know you'll do it well." Marie looked up, her eyes filling with tears. She had never imagined such an opportunity would come her way, much less in recognition of something that came naturally to her. Kindness. She nodded, her voice trembling as she expressed her thanks, a promise that she would honor the faith Edward had placed in her. With these changes set in motion, Edward took a moment to pause, allowing the staff to absorb the gravity of what had just transpired. His gaze swept the room, and he could see the impact his words had left. Some of the remaining staff looked inspired, their shoulders straightening with a newfound sense of purpose. Others appeared humbled, perhaps recognizing the transformation they, too, needed to undergo. The dealership, once mired in an atmosphere of pretense and arrogance, felt lighter now, as though the air itself had shifted. In the days that followed, Edward's vision began to reshape the dealership from the ground up. Training sessions were held, not only for customer service skills, but for empathy, team building, and the principles of humility and respect. Edward insisted on attending these sessions himself, sitting quietly at the back, a steady reminder to his staff that he was committed to these values just as he expected them to be. His presence set a tone, showing that these weren't just exercises but essential lessons he believed in deeply. The dealership began to welcome a wider variety of clients, people from all walks of life, many of whom had heard through word of mouth about the shift in the dealership's atmosphere. Edward saw families who had come to dream, modest professionals who wanted to experience the luxury vehicles they had once thought were beyond their reach, and young people curious to learn about the craft of high-end engineering. The staff began to embrace this new client base, understanding that the value of a customer could not be measured in monetary terms alone. Edward took particular pleasure in speaking with these clients, often engaging them in conversations about their lives, their work, their families. He knew that the simplest moments of human connection were often the most lasting. He spent time with his staff as well, finding subtle ways to reinforce the values he had laid out, sometimes with a simple nod of approval or a quiet word of encouragement. He saw how the young salesman who had once dismissed him was evolving, learning to approach each client with an open mind, his initial arrogance melting into genuine humility. One afternoon, a young woman walked into the dealership wearing a faded jacket, her hair tucked under a well-worn hat. She looked around uncertainly, her gaze drifting over the sleek cars, her eyes wide with wonder but tempered by hesitation. A few of the staff noticed her, and remembering Edward's lessons, greeted her warmly, offering assistance without judgment. Edward observed from a distance, noting the way his team treated her with the same care they would offer any high-profile client. They asked her about her interests, her preferences, showing her models they thought might suit her needs. After a while, Edward approached her, introducing himself and inviting her to take a seat. She was hesitant, still unsure of the kind of reception she might receive, but she sat down, meeting Edward's eyes with a shy smile. "Are you interested in learning more about our cars?" he asked gently, sensing her initial discomfort. She nodded, her voice soft. "Yes, I've always loved cars, but I never thought I'd feel comfortable in a place like this." Edward's gaze softened. "Everyone is welcome here," he replied. "We're here to help you, whether you're looking to buy or simply want to learn more. Luxury should never be a barrier to respect." They spoke at length, and by the end of their conversation, Edward could see the spark of excitement in her eyes, a newfound comfort in the environment he had worked so hard to create. He watched as the staff treated her with genuine interest, showing her the features of a few models, offering to let her sit in the driver's seat, allowing her to experience the thrill she'd once only dreamed of. To Edward, it was a small victory, but one that embodied everything he had set out to achieve. As weeks turned into months, the dealership flourished under Edward's leadership, its reputation transforming from one of exclusivity to one of warmth, respect, and integrity. The changes he had enacted took root, no longer just a policy but a culture that defined the heart of the dealership. He saw how the environment nurtured growth in his employees, helping them find purpose in their work, connecting with clients on a level that transcended sales. The community took notice too. Local newspapers and business journals ran stories about the dealership's unique approach, the quiet revolution that had transformed it into a symbol of genuine service and inclusivity. Clients who had once felt intimidated by the idea of a luxury dealership now spoke of their experiences with enthusiasm, praising the welcoming atmosphere and the respectful treatment they received. Edward felt a profound sense of satisfaction in witnessing the lasting impact of his actions. He knew that he had done more than enact justice. He had created change that reached far beyond the walls of the dealership. His legacy had become a place where wealth was measured not by possessions, but by the respect shown to others, where the worth of a person was not judged by their appearance, but by the dignity they were afforded. Years later, Edward would look back on this time as one of the defining moments of his life. He would see the success of the dealership not as an achievement in itself, but as proof that true justice could be enacted quietly without fanfare, through steady commitment to values that mattered. And as the years went by, the dealership would carry on in the spirit he had instilled, a living testament to the power of humility and respect, touching the lives of everyone who walked through its doors. With Edward's steady hand at the helm, the dealership began a transformation that extended far beyond a simple change in ownership. The shifts were gradual yet profound, touching every aspect of the business, from customer service to marketing to daily operations. Edward became a constant presence, walking the showroom floors, attending staff meetings, and joining the training sessions he had arranged. He was there day in and day out, offering guidance and support, ensuring his vision wasn't merely a flash in the pan, but a deeply rooted change. The staff training sessions were comprehensive. They went beyond technical aspects of sales and dove deeply into the principles of empathy, communication, and respect. Edward introduced exercises where employees practiced listening attentively, honing their skills in understanding and addressing the needs of every individual who entered the dealership. Through role-playing and open discussions, the employees began to see customers in a new light, not as dollar signs or sales quotas, but as people with stories, dreams, and aspirations. Edward would often sit at the back of these sessions, watching his team grow, asking pointed questions to challenge their thinking, and always reinforcing the values of humility and service. Initially, some employees resisted the changes. They found it difficult to shift from the high-pressure, status-driven culture that had been their norm for years. But as Edward's approach took shape, even the skeptics couldn't deny the positive results. Slowly but surely, their resistance faded, replaced by genuine enthusiasm. Edward noticed how their interactions became more authentic, how they began to smile warmly at clients, even those who came in only to browse or ask questions. The dismissive glances and impatient tones that had once characterized the showroom floor were gone, replaced by a sense of pride and purpose. The change wasn't limited to interactions with customers, it extended to the team's relationships with one another. Edward implemented an open-door policy, encouraging staff to voice their concerns, ideas, and ambitions. He regularly scheduled one-on-one meetings with each team member, getting to know them as individuals, understanding their goals, and offering mentorship where needed. For some, this was the first time they felt seen and valued at their place of work, and it inspired a new level of loyalty and dedication. Edward made sure that their contributions were recognized, whether it was through praise in team meetings or opportunities for growth within the dealership. Edward also reimagined the dealership's public image. He invested in new marketing strategies that highlighted not just the luxury of the cars, but the welcoming, inclusive experience awaiting all who visited. The advertisements emphasized the dealership's commitment to treating everyone with respect, with images of diverse customers of all backgrounds and ages, standing beside gleaming cars and smiling employees. Edward made sure the messaging was genuine, capturing the spirit of the changes they had enacted. Word of mouth began to spread rapidly. Clients, some of whom had once felt uncomfortable or out of place in luxury car showrooms, started to flock to Edward's dealership. Families who had previously felt intimidated by the high-end ambiance found themselves warmly welcomed. The dealership began to attract a diverse clientele: young professionals who dreamed of their first luxury car, retired couples looking to reward themselves, and even people who simply wanted to experience the thrill of seeing beautiful vehicles up close. Edward's dealership became a place of connection, where clients returned not only for the cars, but for the community it had fostered. Customers came to trust the dealership, seeing it as more than a business, but as a place of respect and integrity. One older gentleman, a former school teacher who had saved for years to buy his dream car, arrived at the dealership with apprehension. But he left not only with a car he loved, but with an unforgettable experience, having been treated with such kindness that he later sent Edward a handwritten letter, expressing his gratitude for the respect he had received. Meanwhile, Edward's staff began to notice how their new approach to customer service improved their own lives as well. They found that by genuinely listening to customers, by connecting with them beyond the sale, they left work each day with a sense of fulfillment they had never known before. Selling a car was no longer just a job, it was an opportunity to make someone's day, to leave a positive impact, and to create memories that would last. Sales targets and bonuses became secondary to the pride they felt in the culture they were a part of. The dealership's transformation soon caught the attention of the community and, eventually, the media. Local news outlets wrote articles about the dealership with a difference, where everyone was welcomed and respected, regardless of their appearance or income level. The story of Edward Langston, the elderly man who had once walked in, dismissed as unimportant, only to return as the owner, spread through the city like wildfire. People from across the city came not only to see the cars, but to experience the place they had read about. Journalists and bloggers wrote about the dealership, and it became a case study for luxury brands seeking to foster authentic relationships with customers. Edward's story became legendary. People marveled at his humility and the wisdom he had shown in reshaping a dealership that had once been known for its arrogance. The tale of his quiet entrance as a customer, his firm yet graceful response to disrespect, and his eventual ownership was retold in business schools, leadership workshops, and motivational speeches. Aspiring entrepreneurs learned of his transformation of the dealership as a lesson in true leadership, a story about the impact of principles, of never underestimating others, and of the quiet strength of character. The legacy Edward created didn't just transform the dealership, it reshaped how people in the city thought about luxury and success. In a world often driven by status and appearances, Edward had created a space where values mattered more. His story became a symbol, a reminder to always treat others with respect and humility, regardless of who they appeared to be or what they could offer in return. The dealership flourished, not because of flashy marketing or superficial exclusivity, but because it had become a sanctuary of genuine human connection. Edward knew he couldn't remain in the business forever. He was content in his knowledge that the culture he had built would endure, that the values he had instilled would live on through the people he had mentored and inspired. As he prepared to step back from day-to-day operations, he entrusted the leadership to Mr. Thomas, the senior sales manager who had earned the role through years of kindness and dedication. Marie, too, was promoted, her unwavering commitment to treating clients with respect having made her a pillar of the dealership's values. In a farewell speech to his staff, Edward expressed his gratitude for their hard work and dedication, for the way they had embraced the vision he had brought with him. He spoke of how proud he was to see them carry the torch, to continue building a legacy rooted in respect, humility, and service. The staff listened with a mix of sadness and admiration, knowing that they would miss his presence, yet determined to honor the culture he had built. Before he left, Edward made one last gesture that would cement his legacy. He established a foundation in the dealership's name, aimed at supporting young people from diverse backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in the automotive industry. The foundation offered scholarships, mentorship, and internships, ensuring that future generations would have the opportunity to learn, grow, and give back to their communities. The dealership became a place not only of luxury and respect, but also of opportunity, a gateway to dreams for those who had often been overlooked. In his final days at the dealership, Edward took quiet walks through the showroom, watching the interactions between the staff and clients, listening to the warmth in their voices, the genuine connections they had come to cherish. The atmosphere was no longer one of pretense and judgment. It was one of inclusivity, kindness, and integrity. Edward felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had built something meaningful, something that would outlast him and continue to touch lives for years to come. As he walked out of the dealership for the last time, Edward paused at the door, looking back at the place he had transformed. It was no longer just a luxury car showroom. It was a testament to the power of respect and humility. The dealership had become a reflection of his values, a place where people mattered, where kindness reigned, and where every person, regardless of their appearance, was seen as valuable. Edward left behind not just a successful business, but a lasting message for all who would come after him. His story had become a part of the dealership's identity, an enduring reminder that true character shines brightest when cloaked in simplicity. In a world quick to judge by appearances, Edward's legacy was a beacon, reminding all who heard his story that the true measure of wealth was not in possessions, but in the depth of respect and kindness one offered to others. Edward's story became a cherished lesson in the city, told and retold by those who had met him and those who had only heard of him. People looked at the dealership as more than just a business. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when one held firm to principles of integrity and humility. And for years to come, Edward's legacy continued to inspire others, showing that with the right values, even the simplest of actions could create profound, lasting change.